Right there is why I don't join the choir, because it would ruin that beautiful sound. It would just ruin that. Thank you, choir, so much for that. Thank you so much. Today's sermon was originally planned to be preached on January the 20th, but I went out of town unexpectedly with Cindy up to Kansas for a conference that she was attending, and so I moved it to today, speaking on frequently asked questions about tithing. Now, I'm doing something today that I have never done here since I moved here almost 6 years ago, and that is I'm preaching a sermon that I've already preached here before. I haven't done that, and you might be wondering why. Well, there's a good reason for it. When I was doing my stewardship series in January, I was planning on preaching a sermon on tithing, and this particular sermon kind of encapsulates everything that I want to say. It's not like the best sermon on tithing. It's not the greatest sermon in the world by any stretch of the imagination. But it is really a good summary of the things that I felt led to preach on concerning tithing. And so I thought, well, why reinvent the wheel? Let's just go back to that. Plus, it's been 4 years, so it's not like you remember. I mean, I barely remembered it, so you know what I'm saying. But this sermon is broken down into questions and answers. And I put them together, the questions and answers, common questions that I often hear on the subject of tithing. And I've broken it down into 4 categories, each one of those with 3 questions. And so that's how we're going to proceed. So 12 questions, so we can't spend a great deal of time on any one of them, or we'll be here all day. But I want to start with a story about these 2 friends who were in a small airplane, and they had to crash land on this deserted island in the South Pacific. They didn't know it was deserted, of course, when they first landed. But when they did, they both survived okay. But the one guy gets off the plane and he's kind of frantic because he's running around and he kind of scours the island to see if there's anyone else there and what their chances of survival might be. And he comes back to the other guy, and this one guy's in a panic. He said, "There's nobody else on this island. There's no food on this island. There's no fresh water on this island. We're going to die." The other guy was just calm as could be. He said, "There's no need to worry. I make $100,000 a week. It'll be okay." The guy says, "You don't get it, do you?" He said, "There's nobody on this island. There's no food on this island. Your money's not going to do us any good. I'm telling you, we're going to die." The other guy's just casually leaning up against the plane wreckage, and he says, "Look, I'm telling you, I make $100,000 a week. There's nothing to worry about." And the other guy is just beside himself. He said, "Are you crazy? Don't you understand? There's nothing to eat here. There's nothing to drink here. We're going to die." And the guy said, "Look, for the last time, I make $100,000 a week. And I tithe 10%. I'm telling you, my pastor will find us." Some things in life you can count on. Well, let's look at Malachi chapter 3, verses 8 through 10. This is the classic scripture on tithing. It's in the last book of the Old Testament. And the prophet says, "Will a man rob God? Yet you have robbed me." But you say, "In what way have we robbed you?" And then the answer, "In tithes and offerings. You are cursed with the curse, for you have robbed me, even this whole nation." And then verse 10, very famous verse, "Bring all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house, and try me now in this, says the Lord of hosts, if I will not open for you the windows of heaven and pour out for you such a blessing that there will not be room enough to receive it." So let's just jump right into it. 12 questions in 4 categories. The first category is what I'm calling basic questions. All right, so the very first question we're going to answer is, what does it mean to tithe? You can't get much more basic than that, can you? A very basic question. What does it mean to tithe? Well, the word tithe literally means to give 10%. In fact, it's from a Greek word, dekatos. And ordinarily, I don't say Greek words a whole lot because I have enough trouble with English. But dekatos is interesting because it's a word that we get the word decade from, okay? Decade is a period of how many years? 10 years. A decagon is a geometric figure that has 10 sides. You see where I'm going with this? Decatas, this is the word where we get tithe from. It's 10% of the income. So it's a 10%, literally. You know, funny, so sometimes over the years I've heard people say something like, well, I tithe 7%. And in my mind I'm thinking, I don't say this. But I'm thinking, no, you don't. Because that's a grammatical impossibility. Because a tithe is literally 10%. If you're giving 7, you're not tithing. Now, you may be giving 10%, but you're not tithing 7%, because there's no such thing. That would be like saying, I did a decathlon, and I participated in 7 events. Then you didn't do a decathlon. I'm being a little facetious here, but it's true. Because a decathlon is how many events? 10 events. That's why it's called a decathlon. Deca. See, there's that same root, Greek root again. Deca. And so if you only do 7 events out of a decathlon, then you didn't do a decathlon. And so it's the same thing with tithing. You're either giving 10% in tithing or you're not tithing. It's one of these two. So I just wanted to explain that so that we use the word correctly. A tithe literally means to give 10%. Okay, the second question, why should I tithe? Well, the basic reasons why I believe that God has instituted the tithe into his economy is, first of all, it's a way of acknowledging that everything we have is from him. It's a way that we lay before him this tithe to say, Lord, I acknowledge that everything I own is from your hands. And I wouldn't have anything were it not for you. I'm blessed because you have allowed me to be a steward of what I have. So it acknowledges that everything is from him. A second reason that God has instituted the tithe is for us to show in a tangible way that God is number one in our lives. The Old Testament talks about bringing the first fruits before him, the very first of our produce. And so when we tithe, we're giving him the first part of what we have earned, and it's a way of saying, God, you're first in my life. You're number one. I'm putting you first, and so we give him that first 10%. And then a third reason we tithe, and there's a reason I put this third, because I think this is third in priority, but it's a way that it's God's ordained way of funding his ministries and the kingdom work. I believe God could do his work without money. I think God is beyond that, but he has chosen to equip the church in such a way that he uses funds that we give, our tithe, to help work the ministry of the church here locally in our own congregation and, of course, around the world. I believe it's God's way of allowing us to participate in his ministry in a tangible way through our finances. And there's probably some other reasons that we tithe, but those are the 3 primary reasons that God has instituted the tithe. Okay, question number 3 is, what is the difference between tithes and offerings? In Malachi 3, he said to bring in the tithe. We robbed him in tithes and offerings. And a lot of times in the church, we say we're going to receive our tithes and offerings. And maybe over the years you've wondered, what's the difference? Okay, why do we say that? Why can't we just say tithe? Or why can't we just say offerings? Why do we say both? Well, our tithe, like I said a moment ago, is our 10%. And our offerings are anything that we give above the 10%. And when we talk about tithes and offerings, a lot of times people will ask, well, I give 3% to this radio ministry and 2% to this other nonprofit and another 2% here, and I give 3% to the church. And they ask me, I've been asked that my opinion on this. And since I have been asked this before, I'm sure it weighs on the minds of other people too. What's the proper way to do this? Well, I want to give you my thought, my conviction, and my opinion, if you will, but I think it's biblical. Because I believe that our tithe should come to the local church. Malachi said, God said, bring all the tithe into the storehouse. I think that's where you get fed, where you get your meat, and where our tithes should come. And anything we give over that, I think we're free to give to other ministries. But we need to start with our tithe. For example, here's why I say this. What if everybody in the church, let's say, tithes, but they gave 8% to other ministries and only 2% to the local church? What would become of the local church? If we were giving all our money to all these other ministries, but only 2%, let's say, to the local church instead of our tithe. Or, another way of looking at it is, if we give all our money to other ministries and then 2% or 3% to the local church and say we're tithing, then I would say that's kind of like feeding everybody else in the neighborhood but not feeding your own kids. That's my thought. I believe that we ought to tithe to the local church. Now, you may disagree with me, and if you do, that's fine. That's my conviction on the matter, that we ought to start there. But our tithe is our 10%. And what we give to other things, I believe, ought to come above that. For example, Cindy and I, we've tithed in our whole marriage. And like our support for Children of Promise, we support 2 1/4 children. 2 1/4 children and Children of Promise. Because we have 2 children that we support as a family, Jamela and Danilo. And then the Sunday school class that Cindy's a part of, we support another child. But there are 4 families in that Sunday school class that support that child, so that's 2 1/4, right? But our giving to Children of Promise comes above our tithe. It doesn't come out of our tithe, because I feel like our tithe, our 10%, should come to the operational expenses of our church. And then anything we give above that, we can give to Children of Promise or outreach ministries at Christmas time or special days offerings or whatever. Now, that's my conviction, for what it's worth. If you disagree, that's fine. But I feel like our tithe is 10%. I know this is accurate, 100% accurate, that our tithe is 10%. Anything we give above that is our offerings. And my conviction is that we ought to give that tithe to the local church. And anything when we give elsewhere, we're free to do so. Now, again, that's my conviction. But that's the difference between tithes and offerings. All right, second section are biblical questions. Now, that doesn't mean the first 3 weren't biblical, but it means that these next 3 have to do with interpretation of Scripture. All right? So let's go to the next section, question number 4. Isn't tithing just an Old Testament teaching? That's a question that we hear a lot. Some people will say, well, that's under the Old Testament Jewish law, tithing, and we're not bound by the law in the Old Testament or in the New Testament, so we're freed from that. So we're not under the law to tithe. And I've heard that a lot. And I don't entirely disagree with that, by the way. I think there's a good argument there. The New Testament doesn't talk much about tithing. Jesus mentioned it once in passing. Paul didn't talk about tithing. He said to give generously. And he said, upon the first day of the week, let every one of you lay by him in store as God has prospered him, that there be no gatherings when I come. He incorporates giving, generous giving, but he doesn't mention tithing. So there's an argument here to say, well, wait a minute now, that's an Old Testament idea, so we're not bound by the law. So why do we talk about it? Why do we preach about it? Here's what I would say in response. It is true that the law gave us the idea of tithing, and it's not mentioned in the New Testament. However, when you look at the preaching of Jesus in the New Testament, whenever he took any teaching from the Old Testament and related it to the New Testament, what did he do? He raised the bar. He raised the standard for us. For example, in Matthew 5, when he said, you have heard it said in the Old Testament, you shall not commit murder, I say to you that whoever is angry with his brother is guilty. And so Jesus took murder and said that's sinful, but he raised the bar and says you shouldn't even be angry with one another without cause. Or what about adultery? He said, you've heard in the Old Testament, thou shalt not commit adultery. But I say to you that whoever looks upon a woman to lust after her has committed adultery with her already in his heart. So again, what did he do? He took the physical act of adultery in the Old Testament and he expanded on it and he raised the bar. He said, not only are you not to commit the physical act of adultery, but you're not even to look upon someone of the opposite sex with lust in your heart. And so he raised the standard, you see. So if Jesus had said something about tithing in the Sermon on the Mount, like he did these subjects, I could imagine Jesus saying, you have heard it said in the Old Testament that you shall give 10% of your income. But I say to you, that's just a starting point. Sure, you should tithe, and then give even more as God enables you. Now, he didn't say that, I understand, but he didn't cover every Old Testament law. But what I'm saying is that when Jesus took something in the Old Testament, he expanded it and raised the bar for us and expected more of us. And so when Jesus talks about giving and Paul talks about giving generously, I believe in my own heart, and Cindy and I do our finances, we consider the tithes just a starting point. And I think that's a good New Testament standard. You say, well, I don't think the New Testament teaches tithing fine, but if that's the case, you ought to even give more. out of our love and gratitude for what the Lord has done for us. Okay, number 5, what do you mean when you teach or say that tithing is not so much a financial issue as it is a spiritual issue? We say this a lot, in our sermons, that how you handle your finances isn't just about money. It's not just about material issues, but it's about the heart. What do we mean by that? Well, it's a matter of faith, and it's a matter of trust. Jesus said, where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. And so how we handle our money, not just our tithes, but even how we spend our money, how we prioritize our spending, is a matter of the heart. It shows where our heart is. And so when it comes to giving, it shows where our commitment is. Somebody put it this way: the purpose of the tithe is to secure not the tithe, but the tither. Not the gift, but the giver. Not the possession, but the possessor. Not the money, but you. And what God's more interested in than your money is your heart. And the idea is, if your heart's right with God, then you'll want to give. Because where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. And so if your treasure is committed to giving to the Lord, your heart, that's where your heart is. So that's what we mean when we say it's not just a financial issue. In fact, it's probably more of a spiritual issue. Because where your treasure is, that's where your heart is. Okay, number 6. Am I really robbing God if I don't tithe? I believe Malachi 3, 8 through 10 teaches that. Will a man rob God? And he said, you have robbed me. And they say, how? By withholding your tithes and offerings. Because I believe that's what we owe God. In a sense, just a minimal piece of it. In fact, I would suggest you look at it like this as you think about tithing, when you're considering tithing. When we give to the Lord, when we place an offering in the offering plate, we're not so much giving to the Lord as we are just taking our hands off of what already belongs to Him. It would be kind of like if I owed you $100 and I write out a check and I give it to you. I'm not giving you anything. I'm just taking my hands off of what's already yours, right? Because it never was mine to begin with. I'm not saying here I'm giving you a gift, not by any means. I'm just giving you what I owe you. I'm just taking my hands off of what's already yours. And see, God has given us everything that we have, even the other 90%. And so when we give the 10%, we're not saying, oh, God, here's a gift to you, and you should be so grateful that I'm sharing this with you. No, that's not what we should say. We should say, Lord, this is yours already. I'm just releasing it to you. I'm just giving it to you because it is yours. I'm just taking my hands off of what's already yours. Okay, the third section is budgeting questions. This is where it's really going to get fun, right? Budgeting, we all love that word. And so question number 7 is, how do I figure my tithe? I put this in here because I get asked this a lot, How do I figure my tithe? Well, of course, it's 10%, which is the easiest to figure out because you just lop off the last digit, right? 10% of 1,000 is 100 and that sort of thing. 10% of 50 is 5, so it's pretty easy to figure out. But the question that people are often getting at is, should I tithe off of my gross or should I tithe off of my net income? In other words, do I tithe off the gross pay or do I tithe off of my take-home pay? And I don't want to split hairs here, and I don't want to get legalistic, but I probably am going to get that way anyway, because I do have some strong feelings about this. So I'm just going to share them with you. I don't think there's any question that we ought to tithe off our gross. And again, I don't want to get legalistic about this, but I think it's just a logical thing. Because that's what you earned. For example, if somebody hires you for a day, and they say, I'm going to pay you $10 an hour to work for 10 hours, and I'll pay you $100. 10 times 10 is 100. And let's say, they gave you $80 because they took out taxes, okay? You get a check in the mail or whatever, and it's $80. Well, do you tithe off the 100 and give $10, or do you tithe off the 80 and give $8? Well, I don't think there's any question you tithe off the $100, because here's why. 2 reasons. 1, that's what you earned. You earn $10 an hour, $100. So you should tithe $10. Secondly, the other reason, why would you put Uncle Sam ahead of God? Because the $20 deduction is what you pay taxes, or you may have other deductions that come out of your check. And so why would you pay the government before you pay God? So that's why, again, I know people say, "Are you getting awfully legalistic here? Does it really matter? You're talking about $2 here." But, of course, the higher your salary, the more money you're talking about. And I don't think it's really splitting hairs so much. I just think it's a matter of priority and principle. So let me put it this way. I would feel guilty if I tithed off our net, because I just don't feel like that's the right thing to do. So for those reasons, I think we ought to do it that way. Okay, number 8. I think when should I write out my tithe check? Well, it's totally personal preference, but I want to give you some thoughts, of course, or I wouldn't have put this question in there, right? I think it's a good practice to get into if you do checks or however you do it, cash or online or what have you. We are going to try to institute online giving, by the way, sometime this year, so be looking for that. When you get your paycheck or direct deposit or whatever, or at the first of the month, I think it's a good practice to get into. Now, there's no right way. God's not going to say, "Oh, you're going to hell because you didn't write your paycheck and your tithe check out at a certain time." And in some ways, it doesn't matter. But I think it's a good practice to get into to do it first, either when you first get paid or at the first of the month. And here's why. First of all, it shows priority. It shows that God's first. This is the first fruits of what I've received, so I'm going to show God He's first. But also, if you have difficulty with financial self-control, and I'm not saying any of you have that problem, but I know that human nature, and a lot of times people do, what can happen if you don't make it first is you start spending money, and you don't realize it, and it gets to be the 20th of the month and the 25th of the month, and oh no, I don't have enough for my tithe. Because we spent, and sure, a lot of it was necessary, but maybe not all that you spent was necessary. Whereas if you do it first, then you can adjust your spending accordingly by the rest of the month, you see. Whereas if you spend, and then you don't have written your check yet, and the end of the month's coming, and you think, "Oh man, I don't have any money left." And if you do it first, you see, you can kind of gauge the rest of the month after that. I've been doing our budget on spreadsheet for about 10 years now, and the very first column, first cell on our spreadsheet is tithe. The first check we write out at the beginning of the month is for tithe. I'm not boasting, I just think that's the wise thing to do. I don't think there's any thing special about it. I just think it's a wise thing to do. You write it, it's there, and I don't think about it. And Cindy doesn't think about it, it's just part of what we do, And so it's done, and we don't have to worry about where we're going to come up with the money now to tithe, because it's already done, and we have to figure out how to live on the rest of it. And I think if you do it that way, then I think the priority's in the right place. So I think that's why I say do it early, do it first. I was kind of taught this. I remember I had a job at Shoney's restaurant when I was 16 years old and made $50 a week because, I was going to high school and all that. And I remember I read it on paper then because they didn't have computers, it was the dark ages. And, I remember, even then I had tithe at the top. That's what my mom and dad taught me. And it's just something that we've always done. So that's why I recommend that. You just make it first. Make it first. I was talking to Paul Slayton before service. I don't mind me sharing this. When you start tithing and the more you do it, you don't even think about the money being missing or gone. It's because at first, you might think, man, what? I've heard people say, boy, if I didn't tithe, man, I could buy a boat. If I didn't tithe, I could, I could add on to my house or whatever. But if you start tithing, or if you tithe from the beginning, you don't even think about those things. That didn't cross your mind because it's just a part of your commitment to the Lord. Now, at first, if you don't tithe now and you start tithing, it might cross your mind, but the longer you do it, you won't even think about it. Number 9. What am I in a financial situation that prevents me from tithing right now? This is probably one of the toughest questions to answer and one of the toughest situations that people find themselves in because I understand that a lot of people in America are in debt up to their eyebrows. A lot of people don't manage money well, and I don't mean that as a judgment. I mean, I'll put it this way. I have a relative back home that's even told me, I don't manage money well. One of my family members, back home has said that to me. I just don't manage my money well. And, she knows it. And maybe you're one of those people, we all have strengths and we all have weaknesses. I'm not trying to shame anybody. I'm just saying it's a reality. And so that people find themselves in a situation where they have difficulty. So what do? I think the first thing, of course, prayer and praying about it, and then committing to tithing. So I want to do this. I feel like it's the right thing to do. I feel like it's what God wants me to do. So first you got to have the want to, the desire to. If you don't have that, you probably won't make any progress. And then if you need to, if you might need to talk to somebody, maybe a friend, or maybe somebody who's really good at finances, or maybe read some good Christian books on financial management and so forth. And budgeting, I think, is very, very important. I know most Americans don't budget, but at least write something down. If you don't want to budget the whole shebang, write something down and remind yourself to tithe. But it starts with commitment. Because I think a lot of times when we say, I just don't have the money to tithe, I think a lot of time is because we've just gotten ourselves into a tight financial situation. And we have to start by getting ourselves out and getting new direction. It might be getting out of debt. It might be rearranging priorities and spending. But you may want to start and say, okay, I just can't give 10% right now. And maybe say, well, maybe I'll give 3% this month. And then maybe I'll raise it to 5% by April. And maybe to 7% by July. And maybe by September, I'll be up to 10%. They go baby steps. I'm hesitant to suggest that, but I think maybe for some people that just might be the best way to go. But to just work on it, just work on getting to that goal. I read a story about this one couple that got married, and they committed as a young Christian couple they were going to tithe. No matter what, they said, we're going to tithe and be faithful to the Lord. But after a few years, they had a couple of kids and had a mortgage, and then medical expenses came up as one of their children got sick, and so bills started to come in, and they got into a situation where the husband and wife began talking about, maybe we need to use our tithe money to pay some of these hospital bills. It's just getting really difficult. And maybe write a little note to ourselves, saying, I owe God this much, and get caught up later. And they talked about it, they prayed about it, and finally, a lot of struggle talking about this. The wife said, when we got married and we committed to tithe, we didn't tell God that we would only tithe when things were good. We didn't say we'd keep it up as long as we had the money, as long as we were maybe able to save and all that. We didn't put conditions on it. And so they made the decision to continue to tithe. And they paid their medical bills and other expenses as they could. And they finally got through that season. And later they said, being faithful in our tithing gave us that assurance, that we were doing the right thing and that God was going to bless us through this time. And He did. And they were very grateful that they'd remained faithful. What I'm saying is, I know sometimes it doesn't look good on paper. And I know sometimes it can look difficult. But don't just shrug it off and say, well, I'm just not going to do it. Just not going to look at it. I don't even want to consider it. You fight for what's right and believe that you can make those steps to make it possible. And of course, overcoming debt is one of the greatest needs we have in America. So if you're in debt, work on that, because it's a terrible situation to be in. All right, let's go to Roman number 4. These are blessing questions. Will God make me wealthy if I tithe? No. Number 11. Just kidding. I put this question in there because so much false teaching, especially on television, this thing called the prosperity gospel, that if you give to the Lord, He will make you rich, and you'll have boats and a house by the cottage and everything that you need, a fancy car, and good health and all this baloney that just is not biblical, and it drives me crazy. I know there's a verse like Luke 6:38 that says, give and it shall be given unto you, good measure pressed down, shaken together, and running over shall men give into your bosom. With the same measure you give, it shall be given to you again. I get that. But that doesn't necessarily mean God's going to make you wealthy. It doesn't necessarily mean that people are going to give back to you material riches. It just says you'll be blessed and people will give to you, or God will give to you, not necessarily materially. But I think the big weakness of this whole argument is there have been many saints, many Christian people over the years who have given to the Lord graciously and generously, who have been far from wealthy. And Jesus' own disciples, most of them, were not men of great wealth. And so the weakness of their argument is just profound, and it just amazes me how people can be so blind to swallow that kind of stuff. And so there's no promise that if you tithe, God's going to make you wealthy. Besides, that's a bad motivation to give anyway. I want to give money to God so maybe He'll make me rich. What a poor motivation that is. Okay, number 11. How can I be sure, this is a big question, how can I be sure that God will supply all of my financial needs if I tithe. Well, let me answer that question with this question. How can you be sure that God's going to be with you and strengthen you and bless you when you go through trials? How can you be sure that when you go through the rivers, the waters will not overflow you, or through the fire, your clothes won't even get burned? Isaiah 43, verse 2. How can you be sure of that? It's in the Bible, but how can you be sure? Because by faith, you cling to God's promise. How can you be sure that God has forgiven you of your sins, and that when your life comes to an end on this earth, you're going to go to heaven? Because by faith, you believe what God has said in His Word, and you take Him at His promise. How can you be sure that God's going to meet all your financial needs if you tithe? Same way. By faith. Trusting that God's going to do what He says. I know what I'm about to say doesn't make any mathematical sense, and if you tried to pass this off in the classroom, they would say that it's wrong. But in God's system, it's right. That 90% is greater than 100%. Now that doesn't make any sense. It certainly won't pass in the classroom, so don't try that at school. But in God's system, it's true. Here's what I mean by that. God can do more with your 90% when you're a tither than He will with 100% that you keep when you're a thief. I believe God will do that. God blesses that. And so by faith is what I say on that question. By faith, trust God. And I got a little bit more to say about that on number 12. What does God mean when He says, test me, in Malachi 3:10? Because this kind of goes along with that, question 11. What does He mean by test me? Because that's what He says. He says, bring all the tithe into the storehouse, that there may be meat in my house. And then He says, test me. Basically what He's saying is, try me. It's kind of like, you get a trial period on something, maybe a magazine subscription or something online. You could get a 7-day or a 30-day trial period. And if you don't like the subscription that you have, you can cancel, all that kind of thing. That's kind of what God's saying. He's saying, test me. And I will pour you out blessing. I will open the windows of heaven, and there will not be room enough to receive it. And so basically what God is saying is, just put me to the test. Try it out. And we'll see what happens. And He'll bless you. I believe He will. I read a story, it's a true story, about this guy who's going to work at the hospital. He was an intern. And in the place where the vending machines were, there was a change machine. You know how you put $1 in and you get 4 quarters, a change machine? You are looking at me like you've never seen one in your life. But yeah. Put $1 in and you get 4 quarters out. Well, there was this older gentleman at this change machine, and he was putting $1 in, and the quarters would come out, and he'd say, jackpot! And he put another $1 in, the quarters came out, and he said it again, jackpot! And this intern, he's walking by, and he saw that, and he's going into work, and he's talking to some of his coworkers, and he said, this guy out there, he says, he's kind of loony. He puts $1 in, he thinks he's won a jackpot or something. Well, later that day, the intern's going home, and he's walking out the same way he came in. There's a guy there working on the machine. So the repairman, he said, oh, what are you doing working so late? He said, well, I had to come down here and fix that. Every time you put $1 in, it was giving out 6 quarters. So that guy wasn't crazy after all, was it? Jackpot! By the way, I feel like I need to put in a little side note here. If that happens, don't take the money, go report it, okay? Just be honest here. Don't think I'm supporting that kind of thing. I'm not saying that God is going to give you 6 quarters for every $1 you put in the offering, because there's no promise in Scripture for that. I'd be lying to you if I told you that. But what I'm saying is, I believe with all my heart that God will bless your life in ways that you never dreamed. I'm not saying you'll be wealthy, and I'm not saying you'll be rich. I'm not even saying all your bills will be paid necessarily next month. But I know God will bless you. Let me say this. To me, this is one of the strongest things about tithing that I could possibly share with you, although it may sound pretty routine. In all my years of ministry, I've never had one person, now you think about that, never had one person come up to me and say, Pastor, I wish I'd never started tithing. I've never had anybody say that to me. Or, boy, I really wish all my money wasn't tied up in my tithe. I could do so much more. Nobody's ever said that to me. On the other hand, I've heard many testimonies from people who've said, I began tithing, and I just cannot tell you what a blessing it's been. Not because they suddenly got rich, because it brought them closer to God. And it lifted a cloud off of their conscience because they knew they were doing the right thing. And it showed them, even themselves, in a tangible way, that, I really am putting God first. I'm showing him he's number one. And it gives you peace. It gives you peace. I believe integrity is such an important part of our lives, like with finances, not just tithing, but anything. I just couldn't have peace in anything if I did anything that was dishonest or shady or crooked or unethical financially. I just feel like it's a very important part of our lives as Christians, our stewardship. And I just feel personally that it's extremely important that we handle our finances with the utmost integrity. And I encourage you to do that in your personal lives, and certainly as our church seeks to handle our finances, we always want to be honest and above board with everything. No questions. We don't want to put anything out there that would cause anyone to ask questions. Why did this happen this way? Questions are good, but we don't want to do anything that would be anything that would create that type of suspicion. So let's be honest, let's be people of integrity in everything that we do in handling our finances. That's why stewardship is so very important. Let's all stand together as we pray and as